Harlem, New York. In September 1964, Bumpy Johnson was a powerful underworld figure, operating from the streets and businesses of 125th Street. He conducted meetings openly at the Palm Café, a place where deals were discussed in public view. Harlem was known for its culture, its pride, and its tension with authority. It was also a place where organized crime and police power often crossed paths. At the time, Johnson was one of the most influential men in Harlem's underground economy. The environment rewarded strength, silence, and loyalty. It punished weakness, hesitation, and open defiance of powerful rivals. The streets were watched closely. The police were present, but not always neutral. Corruption had become part of the system. Certain officers protected certain interests. Others looked away. Johnson understood this balance of power. He knew which officers were honest and which were not. He knew that business in Harlem was never only about money. It was about control. It was about who could apply pressure without being exposed. In this climate, one wrong move could lead to arrest, violence, or worse. The 28th Precinct, which covered Harlem, had a reputation. Some officers did their duty with care. Others were said to accept payments to ignore crimes or to target selected individuals. The tension between law enforcement and organized crime was constant. It did not always erupt in public, but it shaped daily life. Johnson operated in that system. He understood that the law could be used as a weapon. He also understood that documentation could be stronger than force. In September 1964, those realities would collide inside a small cafe on 125th Street. By September 1964, Bumpy Johnson had established himself as a central figure in Harlem's criminal networks. He controlled gambling operations and maintained influence across several neighborhoods. His name carried weight. Some spoke it with respect. Others spoke it with caution. A former street enforcer who had survived prison time and violent rivalries, he carried himself with calm control. He did not raise his voice without reason. He did not react quickly to provocation. This steady manner unsettled both allies and enemies. People understood that silence from Johnson did not mean weakness. It meant he was thinking. Among Harlem residents, he represented a form of local power in a system many believed was unfair. In a city where organized crime families and corrupt officials often worked together, Johnson was seen by some as a man who could stand against outside control. Among his associates, he symbolized discipline and strategy. Among rival groups, he symbolized competition that could not be ignored. The system around him was dominated by larger crime families and by police structures that were meant to enforce the law. Within that system, certain officers were said to work closely with Vincent Gigante, a powerful figure in the Genovese crime family. These alliances shaped enforcement patterns. Businesses connected to one side might be protected. Others might face sudden raids or arrests. Johnson had learned to operate carefully. He avoided unnecessary violence. He preferred leverage over confrontation. He gathered information. He understood that a written confession could damage a man more deeply than a public fight. Those who worked with him knew that he valued patience. He waited for the right moment before acting. This reputation had been built over years. He had survived earlier conflicts. He had endured prison sentences. He had faced attempts to weaken his control. Each time, he adjusted. Each time, he returned with a new approach. By the fall of 1964, he was not only a businessman in illegal trades. He was a strategist. He watched the movements of officers in the 28th Precinct. He knew which names appeared often in complaints from competitors. He knew that some arrests were not random. Among his inner circle, there was quiet awareness that pressure was building. Rival interests were using police power to interfere with Johnson's operations. Allegations of gambling and narcotics were common tools. Charges could be filed, even if evidence was weak. An arrest alone could damage reputation and interrupt business. Johnson did not react publicly to every accusation. Instead, he observed. He listened. He gathered details. In a system dominated by authority, information became his protection. When officers Patrick Sullivan and James Kowalski walked into the Palm Café on September 15, 1964, they believed they were enforcing the law. They carried badges and weapons. They announced charges of illegal gambling, narcotics conspiracy, and assault on an officer. They expected compliance. But Johnson had already established who he was. He was not simply a target of arrest. He was a man who understood the structure around him. He knew the value of proof. He knew the weakness of corruption when it was written down and signed. In Harlem, reputation was everything. By 1964, Bumpy Johnson's reputation was clear. He was patient. He was deliberate. And he did not forget. But not everyone respected Bumpy Johnson. One figure in particular, Vincent Gigante, embodied a quiet and organized danger. Gigante was a powerful leader in the Genovese crime family. He was known for building influence through careful alliances and steady pressure. He preferred control over chaos. He believed power should remain in his hands, even if it required using others to do his work. Gigante understood the value of influence inside government offices and police departments. He had learned that a badge could sometimes be more useful than a gun. Over the years, he developed relationships with officers willing to accept money in exchange for protection. Through these connections, he could weaken rivals without direct confrontation. He believed competition should be managed, not fought in open war. Instead of street battles, he used legal pressure. Arrests could disrupt a business. Raids could damage reputation. Repeated harassment could make operations unstable. In this way, Gigante treated the legal system as another tool in his organization. According to later confessions written by officers in the 28th Precinct, Gigante paid certain policemen regularly. These payments were not random. They were tied to specific services. Officers provided advance warning about raids. They targeted competitors with charges. They protected gambling operations connected to Gigante. Among those officers were Patrick Sullivan and James Kowalski. Both men had years of service in the 28th Precinct. Both were described in written statements as receiving money in exchange for actions that favored Gigante's interests. Over time, this arrangement became routine. Gigante had learned how to operate without immediate consequence. The payments were steady. The protection was quiet. Supervisors did not intervene. As long as arrests appeared legal on paper, questions were rarely asked. The system moved forward, and Gigante's influence remained hidden behind official reports. To him, Bumpy Johnson was not only a rival. He was an obstacle. If Johnson's operations grew too strong, Gigante risked losing territory and profit. Instead of open conflict, he chose pressure through law enforcement. It was a method that had worked before. When Sullivan and Kowalski entered the Palm Café on September 15, 1964, the arrest attempt followed this pattern. Charges of gambling and narcotics were announced. An additional charge of assault on an officer was added. But no warrant was shown at the scene. No documentation was presented when requested by Detective Marcus Thompson. The arrest was not completed that day. But the attempt revealed something important. It showed that the pressure was organized. It was not random police work. It reflected a larger force moving behind the officer's actions. Vincent Gigante continued his behavior by exploiting weaknesses inside the system. One weakness was internal oversight. According to the later written confessions of Sullivan and Kowalski, corruption inside the 28th Precinct involved many officers. The two men identified a total of 47 officers who were receiving bribes. Payments ranged from small monthly sums for patrol officers to larger amounts for senior officers. Another weakness was silence. Officers who suspected wrongdoing often did not report it. Some feared retaliation. Others were involved themselves. This created an environment where corruption could grow without open investigation. Authority tolerated this situation because exposing it would have caused a major scandal. Nearly 40% of the precinct's officers were named in the combined lists written by Sullivan and Kowalski. Public investigation would have damaged careers, leadership positions, and the reputation of the department. It would also have brought federal attention. Gigante's name appeared 43 times in the confessions. He was identified as the primary source of corruption money. If these documents had become public, federal prosecutors could have opened racketeering cases. Political figures were also named, including Councilman Robert Hayes, who was described as paying officers to ignore code violations and protect illegal card games. This web of payments created protection for those involved. As long as no one spoke openly, the system remained stable. Arrest reports were filed. Raids were conducted. But the deeper pattern stayed hidden. Over time, Gigante came to believe himself untouchable. He had influence in organized crime. He had relationships with corrupt officers. He operated through intermediaries. He avoided direct involvement in street-level enforcement. The failed arrest on September 15 did not appear, at first, to threaten this structure. It seemed like another routine action. But when Sullivan and Kowalski were later taken, questioned, and required to write detailed confessions in their own handwriting, the balance shifted. Those documents transformed hidden corruption into written proof. They listed names, dates, payments, and services. They connected officers directly to Gigante. They described fabricated charges and planted evidence. They created risk where there had once been comfort. The system had allowed corruption to continue because it was quiet. Once written and signed, it was no longer quiet. It became evidence. And evidence could not be ignored without consequence. In that moment, the force that once seemed untouchable faced exposure. The weakness of the system had protected it for years. But that same weakness now made it vulnerable. The first incident occurred during a routine afternoon at the Palm Café on 125th Street. It was Tuesday, September 15, 1964. Bumpy Johnson was seated at his usual corner table. He was meeting with associates. Coffee was on the table. Cigars burned slowly. Conversations were calm. It was a normal business day. At 3:47 p.m., officers Patrick Sullivan and James Kowalski entered the cafe. Their badges were visible. Their hands rested near their service weapons. They walked directly to Johnson's table. Their voices were loud enough for the entire room to hear. Sullivan announced that Johnson was under arrest for illegal gambling, conspiracy to distribute narcotics, and assault on a police officer. He ordered Johnson to stand and place his hands behind his back. No warrant was shown. The moment was controlled, but the message was clear. The arrest was not quiet. It was public. It was meant to show authority. It was meant to show that Johnson could be taken at any time. Johnson looked at the officers and asked a single question about who had paid them. Witnesses later reported that he did not stand. He did not shout. He did not resist with violence. He remained seated. When Sullivan grabbed Johnson's arm and tried to pull him from his chair, Johnson stayed in place. His size and strength made it difficult for Sullivan to move him alone. Kowalski stepped forward to assist. At that moment, Detective Marcus Thompson entered the cafe and demanded to see the arrest warrant and documentation. The officers could not produce one. After a brief exchange, they left without making the arrest. Johnson did not pursue them. He did not threaten them inside the cafe. He did not order his associates to block the exit. He remained seated until they walked out. To many observers, this appeared as weakness. Two officers had entered his regular place of business, accused him loudly of crimes, placed hands on him, and attempted to remove him by force. Yet he did not strike them. He did not escalate the situation. He allowed them to leave. Some in the cafe expected a stronger reaction. In Harlem, reputation mattered. Public challenges were often answered quickly. Silence could be misread. But Johnson chose not to respond in that moment. He watched. He listened. He allowed the officers to exit the building without interference. The incident ended without violence. On the surface, it seemed small. But it marked the beginning of a larger shift. Those close to Johnson expected a different reaction. His associates had seen him defend his position before. They knew he did not accept open disrespect lightly. Some believed the officer's actions required an immediate response. The attempt to arrest him without showing a warrant was not only a legal issue. It was symbolic. It challenged his authority in front of witnesses. Detective Marcus Thompson, who intervened by requesting documentation, later indicated that the arrest attempt did not appear legitimate. To those who understood the system, the absence of a warrant suggested deeper motives. Still, Johnson did not react publicly that day. His restraint was deliberate. He understood that the cafe was not the proper place to respond. A fight inside the Palm Café would have justified further arrests. It would have created headlines. It would have strengthened the officers' position. Instead, he allowed the officers to leave on their own. Those who understood the environment recognized that patience could be a strategy. Johnson knew the structure around him. He knew which officers were believed to be corrupt. He knew that allegations without documentation were weak. By remaining calm, he avoided giving his rivals what they wanted. He did not confirm the charges through anger. He did not provide grounds for immediate escalation. Among his inner circle, there was quiet recognition that the matter was not finished. The public incident had exposed tension between Johnson and officers linked to Vincent Gigante. It had also revealed that Detective Thompson was willing to question procedure. Some observers believed Johnson had lost face. Others believed he was planning his next move. Within 24 hours, events would show that the calm inside the cafe had not been surrender. It had been preparation. Patience in Harlem was often mistaken for fear. But in this case, patience was calculation. Johnson had seen the challenge. He had chosen not to answer it in public. The answer would come later, away from the cafe, away from witnesses, and away from the appearance of routine police work. The next incident occurred the night of September 16, 1964, outside the 28th Precinct. Officer James Kowalski left the precinct at 11:15 p.m. His car was parked 2 blocks away on 126th Street. According to later witness statements, 4 men approached him before he reached his vehicle. They told him he was needed for a conversation about Tuesday's arrest attempt. This time, the provocation was worse. The conflict moved from public embarrassment to private detention. Kowalski was taken to a warehouse in the Bronx. There, he was questioned about who had paid him to arrest Bumpy Johnson. He was asked to describe corrupt activities inside the 28th Precinct. He was told to write down names. Again, Johnson remained restrained in one important way. He did not harm the officer beyond physical pressure used to gain cooperation. He did not release any public statements. He did not attack the precinct openly. He kept the matter controlled and limited. But the situation had escalated. Kowalski wrote a detailed confession. He named 23 officers who were taking bribes. He described payments from Vincent Gigante. He signed the document in his own handwriting. Each incident increased Vincent Gigante's confidence before this moment. For years, officers had carried out pressure without exposure. Arrests were made. Charges were filed. No written proof tied the corruption together. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous. The next incident occurred early on the morning of September 17, 1964, on the Triborough Bridge. Officer Patrick Sullivan was driving to his shift. He left his home at 6:05 a.m. At approximately 8:30 a.m., his car was found abandoned with keys still in the ignition. According to later accounts, he had been stopped at what appeared to be a police checkpoint operated by men in uniform. This time, the provocation was direct. A second officer linked to the failed arrest was taken to the same warehouse. Sullivan was questioned about payments from Gigante. He was asked to list corrupt officers and describe his activities. Again, Johnson did not act publicly. He did not threaten families. He did not make announcements. He waited while Sullivan wrote. After hours of pressure, Sullivan produced a detailed confession. He admitted receiving approximately $60,000 in bribes over 8 years. He described providing advance warnings about raids and fabricating charges. He named additional officers. Combined with Kowalski's list, the total reached 47 officers out of about 120 assigned to the precinct. Vincent Gigante's name appeared 43 times in the documents. Each step moved further from the original arrest attempt. The next incident occurred on September 18, 1964, inside the 28th Precinct headquarters. At 2:15 p.m., Bumpy Johnson entered the building with his attorney, Theodore Green, and 2 bodyguards. He requested a meeting with Captain Robert Morrison. Officers in the lobby went silent. This time, the provocation was institutional. Johnson admitted the officers were being held. He placed copies of the confessions on the captain's desk. He stated that the originals were secured elsewhere. If he were arrested or harmed, the documents would be delivered to newspapers and federal authorities. Again, Johnson remained controlled. He did not demand money. He did not demand promotions or political favors. He demanded only that harassment by corrupt officers stop. He offered to release the 2 officers unharmed in exchange for an agreement. Each incident increased Gigonti's earlier confidence that the system would protect him. But now that confidence faced written proof. The system that had once shielded corruption now stood exposed. In environments like this, confidence becomes dangerous because it blinds those in power to their own weakness. The final escalation in this sequence occurred on the morning of September 19, 1964. At 8:03 a.m., Officers Sullivan and Kowalski were released at the corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue. They were bruised but alive. They returned to the precinct and reported being kidnapped by unknown parties. The official report made no mention of Johnson. The escalation had reached its peak. What began as a public arrest attempt had become a confrontation backed by signed confessions. Everything changed when written documentation replaced rumor. For years, corruption inside the 28th precinct had been discussed quietly. Payments were known by some. Allegations circulated. But nothing had been formally documented in the handwriting of officers involved. When Sullivan and Kowalski signed their confessions, the situation crossed the line. This was no longer about street reputation. It was about evidence. Names were listed. Amounts were recorded. Specific acts were described. Vincent Gigonti was named repeatedly. A city councilman, Robert Haze, was also identified in the documents. The line crossed was institutional. If published, the confessions would have forced public investigation. Federal prosecutors could have opened cases. Supervisors would have been questioned. The reputation of the NYPD would have been damaged. Authority response was minimal in public. Captain Morrison agreed to Johnson's terms. The officers were suspended for 30 days for an authorized absence but faced no criminal charges. No public corruption investigation was launched. The official record described unknown kidnappers. From that moment, the outcome became inevitable. The balance of power shifted quietly. Officers named in the confessions understood that proof existed. Gigonti understood that further harassment could trigger exposure. Morrison understood that open conflict would lead to scandal. The line had been crossed not by violence, but by documentation. What had once been hidden became leverage. And once leverage existed, the structure of control in Harlem could no longer operate the same way. That evening, after the meeting at the 28th precinct, Bumpy Johnson spoke quietly to the men closest to him. He did not raise his voice. He did not celebrate. He did not describe what had happened inside the captain's office in dramatic terms. He simply explained the agreement. He said the officers would be released the next morning. He said there would be no public scandal. He said the harassment would stop. He did not threaten anyone in that room. Instead, he stated what would happen next. He said that if another fabricated arrest was attempted, the documents would be delivered to newspapers and federal authorities. He said that if corrupt officers continued to act on behalf of Vincent Gigonti, their own words would be used against them. He explained that leverage only works when it is real and when it is protected. Those who heard him understood the meaning. The confessions were not trophies. They were insurance. They were to be stored safely. No copies were to circulate without reason. No one was to speak publicly about what had happened in the warehouse. Silence was part of the agreement. Johnson reminded his associates that the goal was stability. He did not want open war with the police. He did not want gun battles in the street. He wanted business to continue without interference based on bribes. He also understood that the agreement depended on discipline. If anyone on his side acted recklessly, it could reopen the conflict. He made it clear that no one was to provoke officers or boast about what had been done. According to later accounts from those close to him, his tone was calm but final. He believed the balance had shifted. He believed that Captain Morrison understood the cost of exposure. He believed that Gigante understood the risk of federal prosecution if the documents became public. Johnson did not predict violence. He did not promise revenge. He described consequences. Those present recognized that this was not the end of tension. It was the beginning of a new arrangement built on mutual risk. If either side broke the understanding, the damage would not be limited. It would spread to officers, supervisors, politicians, and organized crime leaders. The meaning was clear without being spoken directly. From that night forward, any action taken against Johnson would carry the weight of written proof. The leverage existed. It did not need to be displayed. It only needed to remain possible. The setting of the final incident was ordinary. On the morning of Saturday, September 19, 1964, Harlem woke as it always did. Stores opened along 125th Street. Buses ran on schedule. Residents walked to work. The Palm Café prepared for its usual customers. At 8:03 a.m., at the corner of 125th Street and Lenox Avenue, officers Patrick Sullivan and James Kowalski were released. There were no crowds waiting. There were no reporters present. There were no speeches. The two men were bruised but able to walk. They returned to the 28th Precinct and reported that they had been kidnapped by unknown individuals and questioned about corruption. They stated that they had been forced to write confessions. The official report listed no suspects. Inside the precinct, routine continued. Captain Morrison remained at his desk. Lieutenant Frank Chen oversaw detective operations. Officers reported for duty. Paperwork was processed. Radios transmitted calls across Harlem. The contrast made what followed unforgettable. No public announcement explained why the harassment stopped. No press conference described a new policy. Yet in the weeks that followed, the pattern changed. Fabricated arrests against Johnson did not continue. Planted evidence did not surface in new cases connected to him. Officers previously linked to harassment reduced their actions or stopped entirely. Sullivan and Kowalski were suspended for 30 days without pay for an authorized absence. They were not charged with crimes. They returned to duty in late October 1964. According to later statements, they did not resume the same corrupt practices. Within the 28th Precinct, everyone understood the unspoken boundary. The confessions existed. The names were written. Vincent Gigante's name appeared 43 times. A total of 47 officers had been identified in the documents. But the streets remained calm. The Palm Café reopened each day. Johnson returned to his corner table. He conducted business as before. There were still investigations when police had probable cause. There were still arrests across Harlem. The city did not stop functioning. What changed was invisible. The ordinary setting made the outcome more powerful. There was no public spectacle. No gunfire. No courtroom trial. Instead, the shift occurred through leverage and restraint. The week that began with a failed arrest attempt ended with a quiet release on a Harlem corner. To outsiders, it appeared uneventful. To those inside the system, it marked a turning point. Routine continued. But everyone knew that documentation had altered the balance. And that knowledge remained long after the morning of September 19 passed into history. Vincent Gigante escalated publicly. For years, his strategy had depended on quiet pressure. Corrupt officers filed charges. Competitors faced raids. The system worked without open confrontation. But after September 1964, that method no longer carried the same strength. The final provocation came through reputation and influence. Word spread within organized crime circles that two officers had written confessions naming Gigante 43 times. Though the documents were not published, their existence was known to key figures. Gigante's authority depended on fear and respect. Any sign of weakness risked damage to his standing. This time, there was no ambiguity. Gigante allowed it to be known that he did not accept humiliation. He made statements through intermediaries that Johnson had crossed a line by detaining officers. He signaled that no one should believe the balance of power had permanently shifted. The message was public within the underworld. He did not deny the payments directly. Instead, he suggested that Johnson had overreached. He implied that retaliation was possible. His confidence had once come from control over the police. Now that control was uncertain, and he responded by asserting dominance in other ways. Johnson heard these statements. He did not answer through newspapers. He did not organize a public display. He did not insult Gigante openly. He stood. Standing did not mean physical confrontation. It meant maintaining position. He did not surrender territory. He did not reduce his operations. He did not seek mediation. He continued to conduct business at the Palm Café and throughout Harlem. Those watching understood the signal. If Johnson had retreated, it would have confirmed weakness. If he had attacked violently, it would have confirmed guilt and justified retaliation. Instead, he remained visible and steady. Gigante had escalated by testing reputation. Johnson responded by refusing to yield. There was no ambiguity left in the conflict. Each man understood the other held leverage. One controlled influence across organized crime networks. The other held written proof of corruption that could lead to federal prosecution. The next move would determine whether the situation turned to violence or remained contained. According to witnesses inside the 28th Precinct and within Harlem's organized circles, everything that followed happened quickly and without spectacle. There was no shootout. There was no public execution. The decisive action had already taken place inside the Bronx warehouse and inside Captain Morrison's office. Movements were precise. Johnson had gathered the officers separately. He had required handwritten confessions. He had secured the originals in a safe location. He had delivered copies in person to the precinct leadership. He had set clear conditions. He had defined consequences. Before intervention was possible, the outcome was decided. By the time Captain Morrison read the documents, the balance of power had shifted. The confessions named 47 officers. They described bribes ranging from small monthly payments to thousands of dollars. They detailed protection for gambling operations and fabricated charges against competitors. They named Vincent Gigante repeatedly. Once those pages existed, the conflict no longer depended on force. It depended on exposure. When Sullivan and Kowalski were released on September 19, 1964, the decisive action was complete. The officers were alive. The documents remained hidden but real. The agreement stood. There was no dramatic final battle. Instead, there was compliance. Harassment of Johnson decreased. Internal warnings were issued inside the precinct. Some officers were transferred or pressured into early retirement. Gigante reduced visible use of corrupt officers against Johnson's operations. The violence that could have happened never occurred because the decisive action had already prevented it. In the space of 4 days, what began as a public arrest attempt ended as a negotiated settlement backed by written evidence. The speed of the change surprised many who watched from the outside. From September 15 to September 19, the structure of control in Harlem shifted. The outcome was decided not by bullets, but by signatures. And once those signatures existed, intervention by force would have created more damage than silence. The decisive action was documentation. The enforcement was restraint. The result was a new balance built on mutual risk. Everything happened in seconds when the pen touched the paper. After that, the rest followed inevitably. The final resolution came not with gunfire, but with restraint. After the meeting at the 28th Precinct on September 18, 1964, Bumpy Johnson did not attempt to flee. He did not hide. He did not increase security around himself in a visible way. The next morning, when officers Sullivan and Kowalski were released as promised, Johnson remained in Harlem. He continued to sit at the Palm Café. He continued to conduct business openly. He did not resist authority because authority, in that moment, had chosen negotiation over confrontation. There were no warrants issued for his arrest related to the disappearances. There were no emergency raids. The official reports named unknown kidnappers. The system stepped back. Johnson also stepped back. He did not publish the confessions. He did not contact the press. He did not send the documents to federal prosecutors. He honored the agreement exactly as he had stated it. His leverage remained silent. In the days that followed, police presence in Harlem continued as usual. Patrol cars moved through the streets. Officers answered calls. Life appeared normal. Yet everyone inside the 28th precinct understood that a boundary now existed. Johnson had proven his point. When he walked into Captain Morrison's office and placed copies of the confessions on the desk, that was his decisive move. When he walked out of the precinct at 2:47 p.m., that was his controlled surrender to balance. He had admitted the officers were being held. He had acknowledged the risk. He had made his conditions clear. Then he left peacefully. Before leaving the captain's office, according to accounts from those present, he delivered a final line. He said that he was offering peace. He said that if the harassment stopped, the documents would never see daylight. But if it continued, the consequences would be immediate and public. It was not shouted. It was not emotional. It was simple. After that, he extended his hand to Captain Morrison. The handshake was brief. There was no celebration. There was no apology. Johnson stopped immediately after achieving his objective. He did not demand further concessions. He did not seek revenge against the 47 officers named in the lists. He did not try to use the documents for money or political favors. He chose control over chaos. In the months that followed, Sullivan and Kowalski returned to duty after suspension. They did not resume the same corrupt practices. Other officers reduced visible misconduct. Quiet internal changes took place. Johnson never released the confessions. He kept them until his death in July 1968. After his passing from a heart attack, the original documents were destroyed by family members, following his instructions. The resolution was complete. No public scandal erupted. No federal indictment followed. No official report described the negotiation. The city moved forward. But those who had witnessed September 1964 understood what had occurred. 2 officers had attempted to arrest Bumpy Johnson on charges that lacked documentation. Within 4 days, those same officers had written confessions detailing years of corruption. Their superiors had chosen agreement over exposure. And Johnson had chosen silence over destruction. He did not resist authority at the end. He reshaped it. Then he returned to his table at the Palm Café, as if nothing had changed. For Harlem, everything had. Vincent Gigante survived the confrontation, but the consequences remained. He was not arrested. He was not charged in court because the confessions were never published. His position inside the Genovese crime family continued. On the surface, nothing had changed. But the balance around him had shifted. The written confessions existed for 4 years, from September 1964 until Bumpy Johnson's death in July 1968. During that time, Gigante understood that his name appeared 43 times in signed statements from 2 police officers. Those documents described payments, protection, and fabricated charges. That knowledge limited his options. He could not openly retaliate against Johnson without risking exposure. He could not continue using corrupt officers in the same direct way without fear that the documents would be delivered to federal authorities. The strategy that once gave him quiet advantage had become a liability. Behavior across Harlem changed. Inside the 28th precinct, officers who had taken bribes became more cautious. Some reduced their involvement. Some were quietly transferred. Some retired early. Captain Morrison reportedly warned officers that future misconduct would not be protected. There was no public reform campaign. There were no headlines announcing change. But harassment against Johnson's operations dropped sharply after September 1964. Arrests still occurred when probable cause existed. Investigations still took place. But the pattern of repeated fabricated charges and planted evidence decreased. The message required no repetition. Everyone inside the system knew the confessions existed. Everyone understood what publication would mean. Federal prosecutors could have opened racketeering cases. Political figures could have faced investigation. Nearly 40% of the precinct had been named. Silence became a form of agreement. Gigante survived, but he operated more carefully. The NYPD survived, but under quiet warning. Johnson survived, protected by leverage rather than violence. The transformation was not loud. It was structural. The streets of Harlem looked the same. The Palm Café continued serving customers. Patrol cars continued driving their routes. But beneath the surface, the rules had changed. Documentation had proven stronger than intimidation. When the events of September 1964 were reviewed later by those who knew the details, a clear pattern emerged. Escalation. It began with a public arrest attempt on September 15. Officers Sullivan and Kowalski announced charges but did not produce a warrant. Detective Marcus Thompson questioned the legality of the arrest. The officers left without completing it. Warnings followed. Within 24 hours, Kowalski was taken and questioned. He was required to write a confession detailing his own corruption and naming 23 officers. The next day, Sullivan was taken and wrote an even more detailed confession, admitting 8 years of bribe payments totaling approximately $60,000 and naming additional officers. Combined, the lists identified 47 corrupt officers. System failure became visible. The confessions named Vincent Gigante 43 times. They described systematic protection for gambling operations and harassment of competitors. They identified payments from a city councilman, Robert Haze. The documents showed that corruption was not isolated. It was organized. Captain Morrison faced a choice. Public investigation would have confirmed the corruption and triggered scandal. Federal involvement would have followed. Instead, he negotiated. The officers were released. They were suspended for an authorized absence but not charged. No public corruption inquiry was launched. The conclusion was unavoidable. The system had tolerated corruption because exposure was too costly. Once written proof existed, the balance shifted. Authority could not retaliate without risking wider destruction. Organized crime could not continue the same strategy without triggering publication. Bumpy Johnson did not defeat his opponents through open violence. He gathered documentation. He applied pressure through evidence. He forced negotiation by creating mutual risk. From September 15 to September 19, 1964, events moved quickly. What began as a routine arrest attempt ended as a private agreement backed by signed confessions. Years later, the story remained consistent among those who knew the details. The officers were taken. They wrote confessions. The precinct leadership negotiated. Harassment declined. The pattern was clear. Escalation led to exposure. Exposure revealed system weakness. Weakness forced resolution. The conclusion was unavoidable. In September 1964, leverage reshaped power in Harlem. Long after the events of September 1964, the story continued to circulate in Harlem. It was told in barbershops. It was repeated in quiet conversations between retired officers. It was remembered by men who had worked in the 28th Precinct. It was passed down not as rumor, but as caution. The story did not survive because of spectacle. There were no gun battles in the streets. There were no dramatic courtroom trials. No newspapers printed the full confessions. No federal indictments followed. What endured was the meaning. People remembered that 2 police officers attempted a public arrest without showing a warrant. They remembered that within days those same officers had written confessions in their own handwriting. They remembered that 47 names were listed. They remembered that Vincent Gigante's name appeared again and again. They remembered that a criminal walked into a police precinct carrying documents that could damage the entire department and walked out without handcuffs. It was not the act of kidnapping that made the story last. It was the shift in power. In Harlem, many residents had long believed that corruption existed inside the system. But belief is different from proof. In September 1964, proof was created. It was signed. It was dated. It was detailed. That proof did not destroy the system. It restrained it. For 4 years, until Bumpy Johnson's death in July 1968, the confessions remained in his possession. During those years, police harassment against him dropped. Officers named in the documents acted with caution. Gigante adjusted his methods. When Johnson died of a heart attack, the original confessions were destroyed by family members, following his instructions. The paper burned. The ink disappeared. But the memory remained. In places like Harlem, reputation is currency. The story became a lesson about leverage. It became an example of how documentation can be stronger than violence. It showed that corruption creates vulnerability, and that written proof can change behavior more effectively than open conflict. Former detective Marcus Thompson later reflected that the week in September 1964 revealed something simple. Systems that tolerate corruption can be controlled by those who document it. Captain Morrison reportedly managed the aftermath quietly. Some officers were forced into retirement. Others were transferred. The department avoided public scandal. The city avoided federal investigation. Vincent Gigante continued his career in organized crime. The NYPD continued its operations. Harlem continued its daily life. But everyone who had lived through that week understood that the balance had shifted. The story survived because it carried meaning beyond the individuals involved. It was not about a cafe, or a warehouse, or a precinct office. It was about understanding power. It was about patience misread as weakness. It was about a man who did not answer disrespect with gunfire, but with paper. In places like this, power does not always belong to the loudest voice or the largest force. It belongs to the one who understands leverage and is willing to use it with discipline. The legend of September 1964 endured because it showed that even institutions can hesitate when confronted with their own reflection. Power shifts the moment proof replaces fear.